My name is Franklin Edler, and I turned 76 last winter. I live alone in a modest single-story house at the edge of Beach Hollow, New Hampshire, a town that's become more shadow than memory. My days follow a ritual of slow, careful gestures. I wake early, even though there's rarely a reason to. I make my coffee the same way my wife Lydia used to. 3 spoonfuls of Folgers, a touch of cinnamon, and 2 sugars, one of which I sometimes forget until I take the first bitter sip. I sit in the kitchen by the window and watch the morning roll in, not because there's much to see, but because it gives shape to the silence. Lydia passed away 6 years ago. One morning, she simply didn't wake up. No dramatic decline, no slow fade, just gone, like breath in winter air. Her side of the bed has remained untouched since. I still buy her favorite orange marmalade, though I no longer eat it. I keep the jars lined up in the pantry like time capsules that no one will ever open. We had one son, Philip. He lives just 2 towns over, but we may as well be continents apart. He has a wife, Claire, and 2 children I've barely gotten to know. I remember when he was small, the way he used to ask me to carry him on my shoulders through the woods behind our house, his hands buried in my hair, whispering questions about the stars. That boy is gone, and the man who took his place rarely calls, and when he does, his voice is clipped, careful, laced with obligation. The last time we spoke for more than 5 minutes was Christmas, 2 years ago. That was the year I sent a wooden chess set I carved myself for my grandson Miles. Never heard if he liked it. Never got a thank you note. After Lydia died, I tried to stay active. I volunteered at the library for a while, ran a small woodwork stand at the farmer's market on weekends. But as time wore on, the invitations dwindled, the regulars moved away or passed on, and the projects began to gather dust in the shed. My hands aren't as steady as they used to be, and the arthritis in my right knee makes it hard to stand for long. Most days I just sit on the porch with a paperback I've read before, watching the world continue in its quiet disinterest. Philip used to bring the family over for birthdays. Mine, his, the kids. Lydia always made a fuss, baked something elaborate, set out her grandmother's china. Now, birthdays pass like any other day. This year I spent it alone, heating a can of soup for dinner and rewatching an old Western I'd already memorized. No call, no card. When I brought it up to him later, he said, "I thought you didn't want all that fuss anymore, Dad. You always say you prefer quiet." As if quiet and loneliness were the same thing. I try not to resent him. I try to remind myself that he has a life, a career, responsibilities. He took over the family construction business I built from nothing with my own hands. What began as me and one truck is now Edler & Sons Construction, LLC. Though I'm not sure who the sons are meant to be, since I only ever had one, and he's made it clear the business is now his alone. After Lydia died, I offered to help out, said I could still handle some books or client calls. He nodded, thanked me, and never followed up. Later, I learned from a neighbor that he told people I was stepping back for health reasons. I suppose pride is a kind of sickness in its own right. It was different when Lydia was alive. She had a way of bridging the distance between us, making plans, smoothing things over, pretending we were still the close-knit family people like to imagine when they speak in platitudes. Blood is thicker than water, she used to say, though she never finished the real phrase. But the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. She chose her family, even when they didn't choose her back. After she died, the illusion crumbled faster than I expected. The truth is, I've become invisible to my own blood. They include me when it's convenient. A mention in the family Christmas letter. A group photo where I'm half hidden in the back. I don't remember the last time Claire asked me anything beyond, "How's your health?" with that distant, forced cheerfulness. They treat me like a fading photograph on the wall, there for sentimental value, but not to be interacted with. And yet, I remain loyal to them. I buy the birthday gifts. I send the cards. I mail the checks when the kids graduate, even when I hear nothing in return. A month ago, I received a formal-looking envelope in the mail. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakably Philip's. Inside was a printed invitation, heavy cardstock, gold lettering, embossed logo at the top. You are cordially invited to the 50th anniversary celebration of Edler Construction, hosted by Philip and Claire Edler. Black tie, catered, live music, guest list of over 100. At the bottom, in smaller print, family toast at 9 p.m. I stared at that line for a long time, my hands trembling slightly as I held the card. It was the first time I'd been included in anything public since Lydia's funeral. I read and reread the invitation until the letters blurred. Then I placed it on the mantel where Lydia's urn used to stand. My first reaction was confusion. Why now? What had changed? But underneath that, I felt something more dangerous. Hope. Maybe, I thought, he's finally remembered. Maybe he regrets how distant he's been. Maybe he wants me to say something that matters. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. I had an old tuxedo altered, paid extra to rush the job. I shaved every day. Started walking more to improve my posture. I wrote a speech. It was short, heartfelt, the kind of thing Lydia would have approved of. I even practiced it in front of the mirror, trying to get the phrasing right, the pauses honest but not melodramatic. I didn't want applause. I wanted acknowledgement, recognition, a simple nod that said, "We see you. We remember." The week before the event, Philip called. "Just wanted to make sure you got the invitation," he said. "We're really looking forward to having you there." His voice was stiff, rehearsed. He asked if I needed transportation, which was odd considering I still drive. I declined politely. Then he said, "Oh, and about the toast. We got a few things planned. But if you want to say a few words, let me know, and we'll try to work it in." Try to work it in. As if my presence at my own legacy celebration was a logistical burden. Still, I told myself it was nerves, stress, the pressure of organizing a big event. Maybe he didn't mean it that way. Maybe on the day of the celebration something would change. Maybe I'd walk into that rented mansion and he'd come up, hug me like he used to when he was 12 and say, "Dad, I want everyone to know who made all this possible." Maybe, but I've lived long enough to know that maybes are fragile things. They crumble at the lightest touch of reality. And as I stood in my quiet house the morning of the event, adjusting my tie in the mirror, I looked into my own eyes, hollowed with years of waiting, and whispered, "Don't expect too much." Because the truth was, I already felt the edge of something, sharp behind that invitation. Something I couldn't name yet, but that had been coiling for years. I just didn't know how deep it would cut. Not yet. Not until that night. Not until the door clicked shut behind me. The day of the party arrived like a storm I could feel in my bones. From the moment I woke, the sky was low and heavy, swollen with clouds that hadn't made up their minds yet. Rain or no rain. I took it as a metaphor. The kind of thing Lydia would have pointed out with a soft smile, as if the weather always had something to say about our lives. I dressed early, carefully. The suit I had altered looked presentable enough, though the sleeves felt a bit too long and the collar was stiff. I clipped my cufflinks with trembling fingers and stared at myself in the mirror. The man looking back wasn't impressive, thin, weathered, deeply lined, but there was something dignified in his quiet, determined posture. I wasn't going to let them forget me tonight. The celebration was set in one of those suburban showpieces, glass walls, manicured lawn, circular driveway with a valet station manned by teenagers in matching vests. As I pulled up, One of them motioned for my keys and smiled with such vacant politeness it made my stomach turn. I handed them over, already sensing the gap between what I expected and what was waiting inside. The house was loud, with light and laughter, filled with people who looked like they'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. Bright dresses, polished shoes, laughter that never quite reached the eyes. No one greeted me at the door. I stepped into the foyer and felt like an artifact misplaced in a gallery of the new rich. The music was soft jazz, piped through hidden speakers, and somewhere down the hallway I heard ice clinking in glasses and the distant echo of toasts already being made. For a moment I hesitated. I'd expected someone to be there. Philip, Claire, maybe even one of the kids. But I was met with only passing glances. A woman I didn't recognize smiled at me as she brushed past, her perfume leaving a trace of something citrusy and cold. A man in a gray blazer stepped into the hallway behind her and glanced at me, then looked away as though trying to place who had let in the help. I took a deep breath and walked toward the main room. It was beautiful. I won't deny that. High ceilings, dim lighting, elegant furniture rented for the occasion. There was a bar on one side, glowing with underlit bottles of liquor, and a long table laid out with hors d'oeuvres I didn't recognize. Crostini, seared tuna, little towers of cheese and meat speared on toothpicks like culinary topiary. I didn't see a single deviled egg, which Lydia would have found appalling. "Franklin, there you are!" Philip's voice rang out across the room, and for a moment a rush of warmth flushed my chest. I turned to see him approaching with a glass of champagne in one hand, and his other arm outstretched like he'd just remembered something important. He embraced me lightly, the way businessmen hug at networking events, shoulders stiff, backs untouched. "You made it. Great. We weren't sure with the weather." "I said I'd come," I replied, forcing a smile. "Never missed an Edler event yet." "Right," he said, already glancing past me. "Come, let me introduce you to some folks." I followed him into a knot of guests near the fireplace. Philip's introductions were quick and surface deep. "This is my father, Franklin. He started the company back in the 70s. He's retired now." That was all they got. Not the man who built it from nothing, not the reason any of us are here. Just retired now. The people smiled politely and nodded, shook my hand like I was a museum piece wheeled out for historical flavor. One woman actually said, "You must be so proud of what your son's accomplished." I bit down the reply that burned in my mouth. He'd built it on my name, on my blood, on my back. I just nodded instead, after a few minutes of idle chatter that excluded me more often than not. Philip excused himself to greet a client, leaving me by the bar. I ordered a ginger ale and sipped it slowly, trying to figure out if it was too early to slip away to the bathroom just for some quiet. Across the room, I saw Claire laughing too loudly at something, her arm brushing the shoulder of a man who clearly wasn't Philip. She wore one of those dresses that looked expensive and cold, and when our eyes briefly met, she offered a nod so clipped it could have been a dismissal. I tried to find the kids, Miles and Ava, but they weren't anywhere in sight. When I asked a server passing by, he said there was a teen area downstairs, where some of the younger guests were watching a movie and playing games. So that was that. No family toast with them beside me. No sense of legacy. Just separation by generation and inconvenience. At around 8:30, I caught Philip near the back hallway. He was checking something on his phone, barely looked up when I approached. "Hey, son, just wanted to check. Am I still on for the 9 o'clock toast?" He blinked as if I'd said something odd. "Oh, right. About that. We had to cut some things. Tight schedule. Claire's uncle's giving a little speech about the future of the company." You know how these things go. I stood there, words frozen on my tongue. I wrote something. Just a couple of minutes. "I'm sure it's great, Dad," he said quickly. but we really have to keep things moving. Maybe we can do something more casual. Just you and me and the family later, yeah?" I nodded slowly. "Sure." But inside, something folded shut. There would be no later. There never was. I knew that now. I turned toward the hallway and made my way past the crowd. No one stopped me. No one noticed. I found the guest bathroom tucked away near the coat room. It was small, cold, too modern. Stainless fixtures, recessed lighting, a mirror that seemed to show every wrinkle like a road map of regret. I washed my hands just to keep them from shaking. When I reached for the doorknob to leave, I found it wouldn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. It was locked, from the outside. I jiggled the knob harder. "Hello?" I called. No answer. I knocked, waited. Tried again. Footsteps passed by once, but no one stopped. Then laughter. Then nothing. I told myself it was a mistake. A child, maybe, playing around. I waited a few minutes, tried again. Still locked. Then I heard something. Muffled voices just outside. A familiar cadence. "Philip. Just keep him in there a bit. He gets confused when he talks too long." Claire replied lower. "We can't have him go on about Lydia again. He did it last Christmas. Total downer." "I know. He'll be fine. We'll let him out after the toast." I stopped breathing. Their voices faded. I stood in that bathroom, fists clenched, heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted out more than I did. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. They'd locked me in. And still, beneath the horror, the shame, the fury, I felt one overpowering thing rise in me like fire clawing through old paper. Resolve. They thought they could silence me. Bury me in this tiled cell like I didn't matter. But I wasn't done. Not yet. And by God, they would hear me speak. The air in that bathroom grew denser by the minute, not from lack of oxygen, but from the sheer weight of what had just happened. I leaned both palms against the sink, staring into the mirror again, no longer studying my face, but something behind it. The old man staring back wasn't frail, wasn't lost. He was furious, but not the volatile kind of fury that makes you shout or shake your fist. No, this was colder, more settled. A kind of anger that folds in on itself, becomes intention. It had a shape, a temperature, and it was burning just low enough not to boil over. I turned toward the door again, tried the knob, still locked. My body tensed, not with fear, but with anticipation. The voices I had heard outside haunted me, echoing in a loop, confused, a downer. They wanted to keep me away, not because I would embarrass myself, but because I would remind them who I was, what I represented. A man who remembered their beginnings, a man who once stood where they now strutted. My presence wasn't an embarrassment, it was an inconvenience. I reminded them that none of this, the money, the guests, the company name, embossed on cocktail napkins, existed without me. But they'd rather whitewash the narrative, turn me into a relic best tucked away. I could see it now, how carefully it had all been arranged. The passive neglect, the sudden invitation, the brief tight-lipped nod at the door, the rushed dismissal about the toast. It had never been about inclusion. It was about appearance, about control. I had served my purpose the moment I arrived and was photographed in the corner with a plastic flute of ginger ale. And now they'd locked me in a bathroom. I checked my phone. No signal. Of course, the house was built like a fortress, all concrete and steel, probably full of Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and whatever else people use these days to connect to the world, but none of it available in this hermetically sealed space. There were no windows, no vents wide enough to force anything through, just silence and the dim whir of the overhead fan that hummed like the sound of my own humiliation. I sat on the edge of the toilet lid and counted my breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Lydia used to remind me to breathe that way whenever I got riled up about something, usually work, back when Philip was just an apprentice and couldn't be trusted to measure a beam without someone checking behind him. She was always the mediator, always the one who reached for my hand and said, "Breathe, Frank. You'll think better if you just breathe." So I did. Not for them, but for me. I was going to need clarity. 20 minutes passed. Maybe more. I started to wonder how long they'd leave me there. Long enough for the speeches, certainly. Long enough for the photos and the laughter and the final toast from someone who'd probably never touched a single beam or shovel in their life. I thought about pounding on the door, yelling, forcing someone to come and release me. But that's what they'd expect. Some doddering old man making a scene, validating every lie they'd quietly spread about my memory, my awareness, my supposed decline. I would not give them the satisfaction. Instead, I stood up, looked around, and began inspecting the door. It was a standard latch, not high-tech, not reinforced, just an ordinary interior lock, the kind designed to keep toddlers out, not grown men in. I found a wire hanger inside the cabinet under the sink, likely left by a guest or perhaps the house's owner, whoever that was. It took effort to unwind it, to bend it just so with my sore fingers. But after several attempts, I managed to slip it into the gap where the latch met the frame. My hands remembered how to do this. I'd picked many a faulty door back in the day. Bathroom stalls at construction sites, tool sheds with rusted locks, a forgotten storage room at the company's original warehouse. My body remembered the tension, the pressure, the slight rotation required. After 3 failed attempts and 1 broken section of wire, I heard a click. The latch gave way. I opened the door a crack and peered out into the hallway. The coast was clear. The music had shifted to something orchestral and overwrought. Clapping erupted in the distance, muffled by walls and laughter. I stepped out quietly and moved down the hallway, back toward the main room, staying close to the edges like a shadow retracing his outline. When I reached the living area, the lights had dimmed. Philip stood at the front, next to a raised platform adorned with a banner that read, "50 Years of Excellence, Edler Construction." Claire was at his side, smiling that perfect smile she always wore when money or optics were involved. A waiter offered me a flute of champagne. I declined. I wanted my hands free. As I crossed the room, no one stopped me. I moved toward the front, where a microphone stood on a sleek chrome pedestal. Claire's uncle, a man I didn't recognize, was mid-speech, praising Philip's visionary leadership and the timeless Edler brand. The audience nodded, clapped politely. I stood just to the side of the stage, half hidden by a column. My eyes scanned the crowd. Clients, friends of Claire's, city officials, contractors, vendors, realtors, some of them familiar, most of them strangers. And there, near the back, I saw Ava. She was watching the stage, looking vaguely bored. She caught my eye. I gave her a small nod. She blinked in recognition, and her mouth formed a surprised "oh." When the man finally wrapped up his remarks, the applause swelled. Philip stepped forward, holding a glass of amber-colored liquor. "Thank you, Uncle Jared, and thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate not just a company, but a legacy. Edler Construction has always stood for integrity, innovation, and family. Family. That was my cue. I stepped onto the platform. The murmur started instantly. First surprise, then confusion. Philip turned mid-sentence, his face tightening like a wire pulled too far. Claire's hand went to her necklace, an unconscious tick of alarm. "Dad," Philip said quickly, we're just about to wrap up." I took the microphone gently, nodded once, and spoke. "I won't be long," I said. My voice was steady, strong. I hadn't used it this way in years, not since Lydia's funeral. I just want to say a few words. Then you can go back to pretending I'm not here. A hush fell over the room. The string quartet in the corner stopped mid-phrase. I built Edler Construction with two things, a shovel and a promise. The shovel I still have. The promise, well, that's been passed around so many times, I'm not sure what shape it's in anymore. But I remember it. I made it to my wife, Lydia, on the day we opened our first job site. I promised her we'd never sacrifice people for profit, that we'd build not just with materials, but with dignity. I carried that promise in my back pocket every day, even when my hands were too blistered to close around it. People were listening now. Even the servers had stopped moving. I didn't come here tonight to take credit. I came here because I was invited, and because I was told there would be a family toast. But instead of a toast, I got a locked door, a small windowless bathroom where someone decided I'd be better off kept silent. Gasps. Philip took a step toward me. Claire mouthed something I didn't catch. I heard your voices, I continued. You said I'd ruin the mood, that I might embarrass you. You said I talk too much about the past, as if the past isn't the reason this company even exists. I let the silence breathe. So here's my toast. I raised the glass I'd taken from a nearby table. Just water. To Lydia, to promises, and to every man who's ever been pushed aside when his usefulness was no longer convenient. May we all find a way out of the locked rooms they put us in. I set the glass down and walked off the stage. No one clapped. Not yet. Some looked stunned. A few looked ashamed. Philip stood frozen, face pale, fists clenched. Claire turned away as if something on the wall had caught her attention. And Ava, God bless that girl, stood up from her seat near the back and started to applaud. Slow, deliberate. One clap, then another. It spread like a ripple. Not everyone joined in, but enough did, and that was enough for me. I didn't linger after the speech. I didn't wait to see whether Philip would try to salvage the evening, whether Claire would slap on that hostess smile again and sweep it all under the rug, with a clink of champagne glasses and well, that was unexpected sort of laugh. I didn't wait to see if someone would come and ask if I was all right, or if any of the guests would offer a quiet word of solidarity or shame. I walked calmly, deliberately, down the steps of the platform, through the stunned silence of the crowd, and out the same front door I had entered through an hour and a half earlier. The valet was still there, still offering that neutral smile, but even he seemed rattled, as if the ripples from what had just happened had reached all the way to the edge of the driveway. I handed him my ticket, and when my car arrived, I drove off without a word, my hands tight on the wheel, the knot in my chest slowly loosening. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was angry, though I was, or because I regretted what I had done, because I didn't. I couldn't sleep because something fundamental had shifted. For years, I had been swallowing small humiliations like pills. Phone calls that never came, holidays spent alone, gifts never acknowledged, conversations where I was talked over, corrected, minimized. I had told myself it was generational, circumstantial, that life had gotten too fast for the old ways. I had told myself that maybe I was too sensitive, that I shouldn't take things so personally. I had made excuses for Philip, softened Claire's sharpness in my mind, reinterpreted silence as busyness and distance as independence. But that door, locked with deliberate intent, not out of forgetfulness or clumsy planning, but with malice, with calculation, had stripped all that away. It was a gesture too stark to ignore, too cruel to misinterpret. That door was the truth. The next morning there were calls. Missed ones, of course. Philip called once, then twice. I watched the screen glow with his name and did not answer. Claire tried once too. No message, no apology, just a digital echo of obligation. Around noon, Ava sent a text message. "Grandpa, I just want you to know that what you said was brave. I'm sorry about everything. I love you." I stared at that message for a long time before replying with just 3 words. "Thank you, sweetheart." In the days that followed, I went back to my usual rhythm, but the air around me felt different, charged with something electric. I kept expecting Philip to show up at the house, to try to explain himself, to minimize what had happened. He didn't. Instead, I received an email. It was terse, written with the kind of professional detachment reserved for uncomfortable HR correspondence. He said he was sorry for the misunderstanding at the party, that he hoped I understood the pressures of coordinating such an event, and that any emotional reaction on my part was understandable given the circumstances. He closed with a sentence that chilled me. "We believe it may be time to discuss future care options, given recent signs of stress and confusion." There it was, not a real apology, not an attempt to bridge the gap, but a veiled threat. The beginnings of an effort to paint me as unstable, as someone whose mind might be slipping. I printed the email and folded it carefully, placing it in the back of my desk drawer with a sense of both foreboding and clarity. They weren't done with me. I knew Philip too well. He'd been humiliated, and humiliation was something he never wore well. He would find a way to turn this around, to reassert control, to reshape the narrative. Maybe not immediately, maybe not directly, but it was coming. The confirmation came 3 days later. A man showed up at my door wearing a soft blue button-down shirt and a lanyard with some kind of badge clipped to it. He introduced himself as a representative from the state's Adult Protective Services, said there had been a concern raised about my well-being, that someone had mentioned episodes of forgetfulness and paranoia. I stared at him for a moment, then invited him in. He seemed surprised by my calm. We sat at the kitchen table, and I offered him coffee. He asked me a series of questions about the date, the president, the weather, what I'd had for breakfast. I answered each one slowly, clearly, watching his pen move across the page. He looked around the house, asked about medications, support systems, daily routines. I gave him the tour, showed him the calendar Lydia used to keep by the fridge, still updated in my careful handwriting. Showed him the woodworking tools in the garage, the perfectly aligned spice rack, the neatly filed bills. He stayed for an hour and left with a polite nod and a final sentence I wouldn't forget. "I don't see any signs of concern, Mr. Edler. You seem quite capable." When he was gone, I sat down and realized my hands were shaking. That visit had been the second door. The first door had been literal, physical, something you could force open. But this second door, this accusation of instability, this subtle push toward disempowerment, was far more dangerous. You couldn't pick that lock with a wire hanger. You couldn't prove your way out of it with a speech. It was a campaign, and it had begun. I realized I was no longer dealing with a neglectful son and his cold wife. I was dealing with something colder, sharper, a system of erasure, of quiet dismissal. They wanted me to disappear, not dramatically, not all at once, but piece by piece, financially, legally, emotionally. But I wouldn't go quietly. I had lived long enough to know when something was being taken from me, not by force, not with a weapon or a shout, but in that slow, bureaucratic way that leaves no bruises, no fingerprints, only a dull, heavy absence, and I could feel it happening again. This time not to my wallet or my pride, but to my very personhood. The email, the visit from the state worker, the silence afterward. It all added up to a pattern, a strategy. Claire and Philip weren't simply angry at what I'd done at the party. They were mobilizing against me, not with direct confrontation, but with the cold language of concern, with subtle accusations dressed up as worry. I knew that voice. I'd heard it in the way Claire once spoke to waitstaff, in the way Philip talked to vendors when he thought they couldn't meet his timeline. The voice that sounded calm, even kind, but that carried poison in every word. That voice had entered my life now, and it wasn't going to leave unless I pushed it out. 2 days after the state worker's visit, I received a certified letter. The envelope was thick, formal, and smelled faintly of toner. It came from a law firm I'd never heard of, Morgan, Flint, and Abrams, and bore the header, Notice of Intent to Pursue Conservatorship. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it, not from fear, but from the sheer, appalling boldness of what I was about to read. The letter explained that my son and daughter-in-law, citing evidence of diminished mental faculties, were requesting the court to begin a formal evaluation of my competency. They had compiled a dossier including observations of erratic behavior, potential self-harm, and public incidents of confusion. They were asking for the right to manage my finances, my medical decisions, my legal affairs. They were asking to become my guardians, as if I were a child, as if I were not the same man who had built the foundation of their lives, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. For a long moment, I just sat at the kitchen table, with that letter spread out before me, the paper heavy in my hands. I read it again, and then a third time. The language was careful, sterile, legally precise. But behind each sentence, I could hear Claire's voice, measured and chilly, whispering over a glass of wine, about how it's really for his own good. I could hear Philip, brow furrowed, pretending. This was hard for him, that he hated doing this, that he was only trying to protect his father. Protect me from what? From having a voice? From making my own decisions? From standing up at a party and telling the truth? But even as the rage simmered in my chest, a cooler instinct took over. I knew better than to respond in kind. I'd spent a lifetime learning how to survive long games. Construction teaches you patience, delays, inspections, weather, union negotiations. You learn to let others tire themselves out while you hold the line. I wasn't going to fight them with panic. I was going to fight them with process. I called a lawyer the next day, my old friend Walter Klein, who had helped me set up Lydia's will years ago. He hadn't heard from me in a while, but he came over the same afternoon, dressed in a brown suit 2 sizes too large and carrying a briefcase that looked like it hadn't been opened since the Clinton administration. He listened as I explained what had happened, read the letter slowly, and then looked up with something between disbelief and disgust. "You know what this is, don't you?" he said, tapping the letter. "It's a preemptive land grab. They want access to your money, your house, anything they can wrap in legal red tape. They think you're too old to fight back." "I want to fight back," I said, my voice low but resolute. "I want to bury this in daylight." He nodded. "Then we'll start by hiring a neuropsychologist. You'll get a full mental evaluation done independently by someone whose name doesn't show up on their payroll. Then we'll get statements from your doctor, your pharmacist, anyone who's interacted with you in the last year. I want receipts, prescriptions, grocery lists, utility bills, tax filings, anything that shows you're functioning and clear-minded. We'll build a wall out of facts, brick by brick." So that's what we did. The next 2 weeks were a blur of appointments and documentation. I sat in a chilly office while a young woman asked me to recite strings of numbers backward, identify patterns in shapes, remember lists of words. I did it all. Slowly, maybe, but precisely. My memory wasn't perfect, but it was better than most men my age, and certainly sharper than the version of me Claire had tried to submit to the court. My primary care physician signed a formal letter stating I was fully capable of managing my affairs. My pharmacist confirmed my regular prescription schedule. Even my librarian, Mrs. Falco, who ran the Saturday book club, wrote a statement saying I was lucid, articulate, and far more insightful than the rest of us half the time. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew it wasn't just about paperwork. Claire and Philip had power. Financial, social, even psychological. They'd been telling people I was struggling for months now, dropping little suggestions in conversations, planting seeds of doubt. So I prepared more. I backed up all my accounts, changed passwords, moved my savings into a secure fund that required in-person authorization for any withdrawals. I contacted the title company and verified the deed on my home. I checked every joint account and removed my name from anything connected to them. Every step I took, I imagined Lydia nodding in approval from somewhere beyond the veil, her quiet confidence guiding my hands. Then one night, something unexpected happened. I was sitting on the back porch, the sun bleeding orange across the treetops, when I heard a knock on the side gate. I stood, heart kicking up into my throat. I don't get visitors, certainly not at dusk. I walked cautiously to the gate and peered out. It was Ava. She stood there in jeans and a windbreaker, her eyes glassy but determined. I opened the gate, and she stepped forward and hugged me without a word. I hadn't been hugged like that in years. It nearly buckled me. "I had to come," she whispered. "They're saying things about you, Grandpa. Things I know aren't true." I pulled her inside and made tea. She sat at the kitchen table, looking so much like her father had at her age that it made my chest ache. But there was a fire in her that Philip never had, a stubbornness that was Lydia's through and through. "They're trying to make people think you're senile," she said. "Claire told me you called the toaster the microwave and that you wandered off in a store and couldn't find your way back." I laughed, soft, bitter. "I don't even shop with them." "I know. That's what made me start asking questions. But they get mad when I push. They say I'm too young to understand, that it's adult business. They don't want me to talk to you." "Why did you come then?" She looked up, eyes wet. "Because I remember when you taught me how to carve a duck from a block of pine. Because you sat through my violin recitals even when I was awful. Because I know who you are." That night after she left, I cried, not because I was broken, but because I'd been seen, really seen, for the first time in years. And that's when I realized something deeper than all my preparation, something that would become the root of my final defense. If they were willing to lie about me to gain control, then they were also willing to erase everything I had ever been, and I would not allow that. I didn't just want to prove I was competent. I wanted to prove I was still a man, a father, a builder, not just of homes, but of memory. So I made a video. I set up an old camera in my den and recorded myself speaking directly, clearly, with no script. I told the story of the company's beginning, of Lydia's values, of the promises we made, not just to clients, but to each other. I talked about Philip as a boy, the good moments, the hard ones, the time I stayed up all night fixing a birdhouse with him because he cried when it fell apart. I talked about Claire, too, about the charm she once had, the hunger I admired before it turned mean. And then I talked about the party, about the door, about the lock, about what it meant to be hidden away by your own blood. I ended with this. If this is the last thing anyone ever hears from me, let it be this. I was never confused. I was never lost. I saw everything. I remember everything. And I forgive almost everything. But I do not forget. I built something. And I still stand. I burned the video to a disk. Then I made copies. I mailed one to Walter, one to Ava, one to the local news anchor I used to play poker with, and one to a friend in the mayor's office. Insurance. Not to ruin lives, just to protect mine. By the time the court hearing date arrived, I was ready. Ready not just with documents, but with clarity, with a spine forged through grief and labor, and now, betrayal. They had tried to reduce me to a signature on a power of attorney form. But I had rebuilt myself into something more dangerous than an old man with a grudge. I had become undeniable. The day of the hearing arrived with a kind of eerie quiet, the type of stillness that doesn't calm you, but rather amplifies the sound of your own breath. I stood at the window of my living room, watching the late morning sun stretch itself lazily across the gravel of the driveway. My suit, the same one I'd worn to Lydia's funeral, was laid out on the bed, pressed and waiting. I didn't wear it often, not out of superstition, but because it had a gravity to it. It carried the weight of partings and promises, of endings I hadn't wanted but had endured. Today felt like the final page in a chapter I should have never had to write. The day I would stand before strangers and justify my right to remain myself. Walter arrived a little after 10, his hands full of folders, his tie already loosened in anticipation of courtroom tension. He gave me a once-over, nodded approvingly, and handed me a bottle of water. We've got everything. 3 expert evaluations. Letters from your physician, your pharmacist, your book club coordinator. Hell, even your mailman wrote a statement. I didn't ask for that one, but it's in there. He tried to smile. I didn't. They're going to try to attack character, he continued. They know they can't win on capacity, not with what we've got. So they'll pivot, try to paint you as angry, resentful, unpredictable. Stay calm. Don't let them bait you. I nodded and picked up the disc, the video I'd recorded weeks earlier, just in case. Not to show it, not yet. But it was a reminder of the line I wouldn't cross. I wouldn't plead. I wouldn't beg to be believed. I would present the truth and let the rot reveal itself. The courthouse was a modest building, more brick than marble, its age showing in the crackled paint along the window sills and the uneven echo of footsteps in the main hall. The hearing was scheduled in a small chamber, not the grand courtroom you see in movies. It was intimate. 2 tables, a judge with tired eyes, a clerk who looked barely out of college, and a court reporter whose fingers never stopped moving. Philip and Claire were already seated when we entered. He wore a navy suit I didn't recognize, probably new, and she wore a pale gray pantsuit that made her look like she'd stepped out of a catalog labeled Controlled Authority. She didn't meet my gaze. Philip did briefly and then looked away. His jaw was tight. Good. The judge called us to order and began by summarizing the petition filed on my behalf, as if I had requested to be stripped of my own autonomy. The language felt obscene. Walter stood first, crisp and articulate, laying out our documentation, summarizing the evaluations, reiterating the absence of any evidence of mental decline or danger to myself or others. He spoke without flair, without anger, just facts layered carefully like bricks in a wall. Then it was their turn. Claire rose to speak. Not Philip. Claire. She started with what she called context. She told the judge about my so-called disorientation at family gatherings, about my increasingly erratic behavior, about moments when I allegedly forgot names, repeated stories, misplaced things. She mentioned a fabricated incident where I supposedly left the stove on overnight. She recounted, with practiced delicacy, my meltdown at the anniversary party, describing it as confused, bitter, filled with unfounded accusations. She even brought up Lydia, claimed I'd recently told her Lydia had called me, long after her death. That was the first time my hands clenched under the table. I wanted to rise, to shout. Lydia had never been a tool to me. She was the one truth I never manipulated, never twisted to suit my needs. But I remembered Walter's voice. Don't let them bait you. And I stayed still. I breathed. I waited. Philip stood next. His voice was softer, almost sorrowful. He talked about growing up with me as a strict father, about the pressure he'd felt to live up to my expectations, how he'd seen changes in me after Lydia died. Withdrawal, depression, anger. He framed it all as concern. Said he just wanted to help, that he feared for my safety, that he loved me dearly and didn't want to see me hurt. The room was quiet when he finished. Then the judge looked at me. Mr. Edler, do you wish to respond? I stood slowly, letting the silence settle around me before I spoke. I want to thank you for your patience, Your Honor. I know these cases are never easy. They involve family, memory, grief, and sometimes betrayal. But I'm here today not because I forgot to pay a bill or called someone by the wrong name. I'm here because I told the truth. At a party, in front of people who were not supposed to hear it. I turned slightly, not to look at them, but to make sure they heard me. My son and daughter-in-law have decided that because I am old, I must be fading. That my voice no longer matters. That my discomfort, my pain, my sense of abandonment, those things can be dismissed as confusion. But I am not confused. I know exactly what happened. I know I was locked in a bathroom, deliberately. I know I was excluded. And I know that when I refused to play along, they moved to silence me. Legally. I paused, then added, They say I talk too much about the past. But the past is not dead. It's the foundation of every story they now try to rewrite without me. I may be 76, but I'm not gone. Not yet. I looked at the judge directly. I ask only one thing. Do not let the machinery of convenience turn me into someone I'm not. Then I sat. The judge called a recess. Outside the chamber, Philip approached me in the hallway. Claire stayed behind. Dad, he said, and for the first time in years, his voice had no mask. Why are you doing this? I looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of wonder. You locked me in a room, then you tried to take everything, and you ask me why I won't surrender? He didn't answer, just turned away. The judge returned with a ruling 2 hours later. The petition was denied. There was no basis for conservatorship. My evaluations were clear. My legal autonomy remained intact. No conditions, no review, no further action. Claire stood, gathered her bag, and walked out without looking back. Philip lingered, as if hoping for something. Absolution, maybe. He didn't get it. Walter and I left the courthouse together, the late afternoon sun now high and harsh. As we reached the sidewalk, he turned to me and asked, "What now?" I looked down the street, the cars, the people, the ordinary rhythm of a world that had no idea a war had just been fought in a quiet room behind sealed doors. Now, I said. Now I begin living again. The weeks after the hearing unfolded not with fanfare, not with vindication, but with something quieter and in its own way far more powerful. Clarity, the kind that arrives not in grand pronouncements, but in the slow, undeniable settling of truth. I woke each morning no longer weighed down by expectation, no longer waiting for a phone call that would never come, no longer pacing the house rehearsing things I wished I'd said. The silence remained, but it was no longer empty. It was mine. It wasn't forced upon me. I had reclaimed it. I had won not just the right to make my own decisions, but the right to see clearly who stood beside me and who had been pretending all along. Philip didn't call again. Not after the hearing, not after the decision was filed, not even when the local newspaper ran a small column about elder rights and mentioned the case in passing. Claire made no move to repair the fracture either. Whatever narrative they had crafted about me, senile, unstable, difficult, was no longer useful once it had been exposed in a courtroom. They had taken their shot and missed, and with it, any remaining illusion of reconciliation evaporated. They vanished not like people retreating in shame, but like people who realized the mask no longer worked and had no further use for the performance. But Ava returned. She came over once a week, sometimes more. She brought books, helped me sort through old photo albums, asked me about Lydia. Really asked, with patience and interest, and that particular kind of attentiveness that feels like a gift in a world addicted to distraction. I told her everything. About how I met her grandmother in a train station, about the night we painted the first Edler construction sign by hand, about the house we almost lost during the recession, but saved by selling the car and riding bicycles to the office for 3 months. I told her about the fight Philip and I had when he was 20 and wanted to quit college to sell imported knives. I told her about the day he took his first solo job and how proud I'd been, even though I never said it the way he needed to hear. And then I told her about the party, about the door, about the lock. She cried. And then she did something that will stay with me until the day I die. She reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "You're not invisible to me." That sentence did more for my heart than any courtroom ruling could. Spring came slowly that year, as it always does in New Hampshire, muddy, indecisive, but stubborn in its insistence that warmth will return. I reopened the workshop behind the house, cleaned the tools, sharpened the blades, sanded the dust from the woodpile. I began building again. Not for money, not for legacy, but for myself. I made a bench, then a cabinet, then a small wooden box with dovetail joints so precise it felt like a prayer. I gave that box to Ava. She keeps letters in it, she told me later. Private things, important things. Neighbors began to stop by more often, not out of pity but curiosity. They'd heard about what happened, seen the article, watched the clip Ava quietly uploaded of my speech from the party, which had, against all odds, gone mildly viral. Elderly man silenced at family business gala. Speaks the truth. I became, briefly and absurdly, an internet figure, but it wasn't the attention that mattered. It was the recognition. I was no longer spoken about in past tense. I was here, present, accounted for. One evening, as I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, the air thick with the scent of pine and thawing earth, I caught sight of my own reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in years, I didn't look like a man waiting for something to be returned. I looked like a man who had let go of something heavy, and in doing so, had made room for something new. Not forgiveness, at least not yet, but peace, and perhaps that's all we can really hope for in the end. Not that those who wronged us will pay, or change, or even understand, but that we might live on regardless, that we might build something honest from the wreckage. I have not heard from Philip since that day in court. I don't expect to. There's no ceremony in estrangement, no declaration, just a silence that hardens into distance and then becomes permanent. I no longer keep his number saved in my phone, but I haven't deleted it either. Not out of hope, but memory. Some ghosts deserve a name. Sometimes, late at night, I still imagine Lydia sitting at the table across from me. I ask her if she's proud. I like to think she smiles. Not the big, bright grin she gave the world, but the quiet, private one she reserved just for me. The one that said, "You did the right thing, even though it hurt." And that's what I hold on to, because in the end, I wasn't silenced. I spoke, and that made all the difference.